Welcome to Tech for Good with Bethnal Green Ventures. My name's Paul Miller, and it's wonderful to be joined today by Elin Haf Davies, founder and CEO of Aparito. Hello, Elin.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No worries. So let's start with Aparito. What does the company do and why does it matter? And also, how do you say it? Have I got it right?
Yes, we founded Aparito probably 12 years ago now, and we do pronounce it Aparito, but it gets pronounced in many ways, and we don't mind that particularly. But we developed a software platform called Atom5, which enabled patients to report how they feel and function in the forms of clinical outcome assessment in their own homes or even in clinic, but using digital forms, particularly an app on their phone.
And why does that matter? Who are you helping, if you like, in terms of the way that clinical trials are done?
My experience of supporting patients and families through clinical trials, and particularly pediatric patients, was to sort of really understand just how burdensome it was in the number of times, the frequency that you have to visit a hospital to complete paper-based questionnaires or to complete some assessments. And then just the total number of assessments that you need to do means that the time that you need to spend in clinic is 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 days at a time. And when you're, managing other life, siblings, other family members, work, to take that amount of time off to travel to clinic, which can often also be quite a distance away from where you live, it becomes really problematic. So we were trying to make patients' experience of clinical trials more patient-centric and open it up to more patients that they can then do it in their own home.
Fantastic. Now, and a bit about you. Tell us where you grew up and I guess what you thought you'd be when you grow up. Did you think you'd be an entrepreneur? How did that come about?
Yeah, well, no, not at all is the short answer. But the slightly longer answer is, as my name probably gives it away, but I'm Welsh. I grew up on a farm in North Wales, the youngest of 4. And I guess, being a farmer's daughter, you really see what an entrepreneurial spirit is in terms of having to work morning till night and find all sorts of different ways to make things happen. But for me, I always thought I would be a children's nurse. That was the one and only thing that I ever thought of doing as a child, and I guess in some ways fulfilled a childhood dream when I started my nurse training at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And as I said, I thought that I would be nursing clinically forevermore. But as things happened and opportunities came along, I moved to do a clinical research nurse role, which means supporting children that were taking part in clinical trials. And through that, I got to sort of really understand the patient burden and the whole family that's sort of going through clinical trials. So I went on to do my PhD looking at developing new markers, and then completely unexpectedly left clinical and academia completely to work as a regulator at the European Medicine Agency. So they were launching a pediatric regulation that mandated that pharmaceutical companies considered the need of children in the development of medicines. And then after that, I just thought, the reason things aren't changing is people aren't creating these tools. And very naively, I thought, okay, well, I'll just set out and do that myself. And that was the beginning of Aparito.
Yeah. And was there a particular moment or experience that made you think, I need to build this?
So when I was clinical, I kept challenging the pharmaceutical companies going, why are you doing it this way? Why are you not developing new ways? And they would always come back with the answer of, it's the regulators. They force us to do it this way. And then when I was a regulator, I would challenge the pharmaceutical companies going, well, why are we doing it this way? Why are we not developing new ways? And they'd go, it's the clinicians. They say it's the only way that it can be done. And I don't think there was any intentful deceit going on. It's just these things had just become inertia and nobody really wanted to invest. And so after 6 years as a regulator, really trying to influence more sort of decentralized, digital, patient-friendly clinical trials, I realized, well, nobody else seems to be developing these tools, so I might as well do it, much to my parents' distress that I was leaving a very good employment with the European Medicine Agency. I set off on the journey.
I mean, you were in quite a unique position, really, weren't you? Because you'd picked up that experience both as nurse clinical research and regulator.
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes I think of myself as a bit of a jack of all trades, potentially masters of none. But when it came to founding Aparito, just understanding, what the pain points was from a clinician's point of view, from a patient's point of view, from a researcher's point of view, and of course what the regulators were expecting was incredibly helpful because I could already consider and put that into, the storyboards, if you like, of what all of these different players would need from a software platform like Atom 5.
Can you give an example of how Aparito works in practice? Maybe even from a patient's point of view. What's their experience of it?
Yeah, so from a patient's point of view, they would download an app on their phone after they've consented to take part in a study. And that app would guide them through either a consent to sort of say that they're willing to take part, or step-by-step instructions of how to complete some assessments. So some assessments may be as simple as scales or questionnaires, how are you feeling today, from a scale of 1 to 10. Others become a bit more complicated. So they ask you to do video-based assessments. So these could be assessments that you would sometimes do in the clinic with the clinician. So the SARA scale, the Severity Ataxia Rating Scale, has 5 modules where we look at fine motor skills like finger to nose or stance in terms of swaying in the gait is one example. Or another one would be one often used in Parkinson's disease called timed up and go. So they sit on a chair. When the prompt alerts them, they stand up, they walk 3 meters, do a 180-degree turn, and then walk back. So these are sort of modifying in-clinic assessment into a digital modality, but they can do it in their own home without all the travel and the stress, and share them more frequently with the doctors. And then another one could be completely different in the what we call activities of daily living. So for children that are living with sort of neuroprogressive disorders, activities of daily living such as eating, dressing, playing becomes quite difficult. But when you try and reenact those in the hospital environment, they're not quite sterile. So we encourage the parents to sort of record those in a standardized way that they can then be assessed and scored by a healthcare professional.
I was going to say, in some ways, what you're doing is better than the way the clinical trials were done. You're not just repeating, because you're getting rid of that white coat syndrome, aren't you? The stress that comes from having to go to hospital in order to do tests, and then the results are different.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was always sort of where the aspiration was. As a ex-nurse, or I do appreciate that patients and families do still appreciate that in clinic time, because it is important from the relationship build. And also there are times where you kind of go, oh, while I'm here, can I ask you about this? Or while I'm here, can I ask you about that? So that, I'm not anticipating anytime soon that some of that in clinic time, but the frequency and the quality of what these tools could offer just adds a lot more granular aspect to the data that can be captured during a clinical trial.
And tell us a bit actually about the size of the company and so on as well, because you have been going for, well, just over a decade now, haven't you?
Yeah. So we never grew massively, if you like. At the peak, we only got to 34 number of colleagues. So we had 4 in Barcelona and 30 here in Wrexham in Wales. We, and Paul, you obviously would have been with us on the journey. We never really secured vast amount of investment. We only raised a relatively small amount for tech companies, which meant that we had to focus very much on growing organically. So winning contracts and then recruiting slowly. And I think in hindsight, that served very well for us, because actually in healthcare, this blitz scale thing doesn't sort of work in terms of adoption in healthcare. So, but yeah, it was great to see the team grow slowly over time.
And then Aparito was acquired by Eli Lilly last year. How did you decide that was going to be a good home for Aparito?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, Aparito was sort of founded a good decade ago, and I joke, but that was BC, before COVID. And BC, there was definitely a huge amount of resistance to the concepts of doing things digitally in the home or in a different way. And the industry had sort of, very, very risk averse and would just not be inclined to change anything unless they were forced to. And of course, then COVID came along and forced a complete rethink of everything and opened the door from being, I doubt we can do it, to please show us how we can do it. And while COVID was obviously very devastating, we did benefit significantly from that change in mindset, and it opened a lot of doors. And the other thing is we could all of a sudden win contracts with American clients without having to fly there every 3 seconds or having a footprint in the US. So we saw a big growth over COVID that did generate a lot of interest from sort of PE funds and others. So we got a few approaches, asking what our, exit sort of aspirations were. And we did follow those conversations kind of a bit because I was curious to know, but they never felt right. They never felt like it would be the right home for Aparito. And so when Lilly came along, we'd had conversations with them for a good 3 to 6 months where we were thinking that they were looking for another vendor to support their current clinical trials. So it was a complete shock, really, when out of the blue, they asked to schedule a call and said, by the way, we're thinking of buying you. What do you think? And the reason I did think Lilly was a very good home for Aparito was, currently it's obviously, one of the most exciting pharmaceutical companies in terms of its assets portfolio, its AI strategy, but they're very patient focused and they kind of had similar aspirations around patient experience of clinical trials, patient centricity in clinical trials, and also site support that reassured me that Atom 5 would continue to be developed in the roadmap sort of way that we wanted to. And then critically, there was an assurance of kind of looking after all the team and retaining all the team as part of the acquisition too.
Amazing. So what's something you've learned along that journey? Maybe the hard way. What have you learned about building a company with a social mission like the one that you've had?
Yeah, so many scars, so many highs and lows. And generally on the whole, it did feel there were more lows. Definitely the hardest 2 parts for me were building the team. Obviously I had no tech experience, and trying to build a tech team with no tech experience is actually really difficult because it relies a lot on trust and mutual understanding. And yeah, we certainly didn't get that right at the beginning. And that was probably one of the biggest, mistake or kind of errors that I did along the way, that then helped us. So when we did regroup a tech team, it made all the difference because we'd learned, I guess, from that experience.
Yeah,
but
you knew it was right then.
yeah, but that was certainly, and that could have actually resulted in the company completely collapsing. And I think that's the sad part when you realize that there's possibly loads of other great companies there, and just whether they manage to get the right tech team or not behind them is the difference of whether it's a success or not. So that was really difficult and a very expensive mistake from my part. But, at least we were able to regroup and go on to live the next chapter as such. And now we have the most amazing tech team, in Wrexham in Wales, and so dedicated to the mission that, it sort of nearly makes it all feel worthwhile. And then the next, I think, that was incredibly difficult for us were the finance side of things and chasing the investment. On reflection, I completely appreciate that I didn't adjust to speak the language that investors needed to hear. I felt that they would too be so moved and inspired by the patient experience that we were trying to change. The numbers would just fall into place after, but they just needed to see the numbers first, regardless of what we were or weren't doing on a social mission. So I've lost count of the number of meetings we had with investors and just how soul destroying that became, just to have constant negativities or rejection. But, I think people say it doesn't make it feel any better at the time. But, you realize that actually all entrepreneurs and founders go through it. I think I would have actually been far better to stop pursuing investors and just keep lean and growing organically. And if I would give, some advice to myself back then, is stop the investment thing, just be lean, be kind of super, focused, and just carry on growing the business organically through new contracts and revenue.
And what's one part of the work that you really love? And maybe, we've talked about fundraising, which you don't have to do anymore, but what's one part that you find tougher?
The part that I really love, and the reason why I started it was kind of my North Star, which, with every disease group or with every sort of therapeutic area, is sort of really starting to understand, how do we measure what matters to patient? How do we define meaningful aspects of health? And then how do we find the right technology or digital tools to measure that in a way that's least disruptive for patients and sites. And that's the bit I absolutely love, is sort of what are we trying to measure and how are we trying to measure, and how do we kind of make that in a way that's really easy but really insightful for the data that we're capturing, and then rolling that out into clinical trials and research, and sort of seeing the data come through is very very fulfilling. When I founded Aparito, it was really weird because zero corporate, zero startup, zero commercial background, a civil servant through and through. And people kept asking me, what's your exit strategy? And I was generally baffled. I was like, I couldn't understand what they meant by that. Because for me, all I wanted was to have a drug approved by the FDA with data generated using Atom 5. And that was my absolute go-to. That was what success was going to be looking like for me. And I'm glad, to be honest, because I think if I'd have been chasing an exit instead of chasing that, I would have made a lot of mistakes and bad decisions. And I'm not sure that, the pain would have been worth it along the way.
Cool. Aside from Aparito and your sort of career previously, you have also rowed across several oceans.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. And then also, I want to know, which is harder, rowing across oceans or starting a startup?
Yeah, no, it's not your usual conversation starter. But when I was 30, a fellow nurse, Herd Ipsidy, and we were both working at Great Ormond Street Hospital, decided to row across the Atlantic Ocean, just the two of us. As you do. And we were raising money for metabolic research at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And it was an absolute life-changing experience. The reason why I decided to row across the Atlantic, I guess I won't go into detail, but the outcome was it was just the most sort of life-transformative experience. And we raised significant amount of money for Great Ormond Street Hospital, which funded research to look at the use of vitamin B in managing neonatal seizures. But I just also realized that I loved life at the ocean. So I then went on to be part of the first female crew to ever row across the Indian Ocean. So from Australia to Mauritius, and then went on to learn how to sail. So my time on the oceans were just incredibly important chapters in my life, and just taught me a lot about resilience and, kind of just perseverance and how to adapt, when things go wrong, to sort of respond to them in the way that you just have to pull through and find your own inner strength or resources sort of to adjust to that. And so, yes, I think a combination of being a farmer's daughter, a nurse, where you have to sort of improvise and be sort of quite committed, was then sort of really cemented, if you like, by the experience of being on the oceans. And it absolutely gave me a bit of grit and strength and determination to push through with Aparito. But I always say that Aparito was far harder than rowing any ocean because, the goals kept changing in terms of the destination, the finish line. And that concept of being pushed further back by the wind than you could row forward very much resonates how Aparito felt it at times.
And, what advice would you give to someone thinking about starting their own tech for good venture now? Somebody who's just setting out on that journey.
Yeah, I mean, my personal experience would be is that, you have to absolutely want to live and breathe the mission that you want to go for. I would not I would find it hard if you thought more around the fact I want to run my company or build my own company versus I want to sort this problem. And I think that's an important distinction, really, because you have to be so dedicated and passionate to that one mission that you're trying to solve or support or, you know, enable. And if you know that that gets you excited when you're jumping out of bed in the morning or keeps your mind racing, thinking all sort of things at night, then yes, absolutely go for it. But it's not something that you can do half-hearted. It's a real kind of living, breathing, full-on things 24/7. And it's always going to take twice as long as you think it would take.
Yeah, great. Well, Elin, thank you so much for joining us today on Tech for Good. It's an amazing journey, and yeah, so well done to you.
Well, thank you so much. I think, you know, I've said it often enough, but BGV were absolutely instrumental in our journey, not just, you know, from right off the offset where we just had those 10 slides of PowerPoint that we had some random ideas and, you know, how you kind of, I guess, believed in us back then, but also supported and backed us throughout. So, yeah, we never could have survived without BGV. And so very, very grateful for all your support over the years.
Our pleasure. Well, if you have questions for guests or topics we should be covering on Tech for Good, do get in touch. And if you're thinking of starting a Tech for Good venture and looking for investment, don't forget to check out bethnalgreenventures.com to see whether we might be able to help. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening and goodbye.
Thank you.